Hi everyone, I'm Anna Sinitsa from Rome, and today we're in Rome. Rome is a city where the past and the present blend on winding, narrow cobblestone streets where every stone seems to breathe history, and yet life here hasn't stopped for a single second for almost 3,000 years. It's easy to get lost here and then find yourself again because every turn hides a new discovery. Time flows differently here. Being half an hour late is normal and punctuality is considered out of place. Rome is a city where food is a religion. People here argue about the best carbonara with the same passion they argue about football. Where coffee isn't just a drink, it's a way of life. Espresso is drunk standing at the bar, and ordering a cappuccino after midday is basically taboo for locals. Interestingly, Rome has around 2,000 fountains, more than any other city in the world. And there are more than 900 churches here, too. That's a record for a single city. Here, you might even see a nun riding a scooter and a businessman walking around in sandals. Rome is a city of contrasts, where luxurious villas stand right next to rundown houses and high-end designer boutiques sit alongside charming antique shops. Where endless traffic jams coexist with a laid-back pace of life, and behind the bustling squares you'll find quiet, cozy courtyards. It's a city of eternal beauty and eternal problems with public transport. Here, water still flows through ancient aqueducts, but mobile reception can be patchy. Tradition is sacred here, yet innovation is welcomed. After all, electric scooters are parked right next to the walls that are 2,000 years old. And you may not be able to understand it, but you can love it endlessly. Everyone finds their own Rome here. And today I'm going to show you my Rome. Rome is the city of Caesar popes and the city I've called home for 15 years. So over the next 2 hours, we're going to explore Rome from the inside. We're in for lots of stories, lots of art, and of course, the quirks of local life. Stay with us. It's going to be really interesting. I ordered this dish just for you. Rome is more than just the Colosseum. Besides, Rome isn't just an ancient city. It isn't just the birthplace of Baroque or the city where Caravaggio and Michelangelo worked. Rome is, above all, its people. In Rome, living in the city center is still very prestigious, which is why it hasn't lost its charm. And today we're going to take a look at this Rome from the inside. I'll be your personal guide because I've not only lived here for 15 years, but I've also been leading tours all this time, exploring the most charming corners of Rome. Rome is the largest city in Italy. It has a population of 2,850,000 people. And just imagine, every year, the magnificent city of Rome welcomes 50 million tourists from all over the world. We're going to explore Rome from the inside and see how ancient traditions and customs still shape the city's everyday life. And you know the famous saying, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. So, it's morning now. Let's go and have some coffee. We're going to have coffee at the oldest cafe in the city. It first opened back in 1760. Nekrasov, Gogol, Wagner, and even Byron used to come here for coffee. The atmosphere here has been preserved. Back then, coffee was several times more expensive, so it was mostly aristocrats and intellectuals who came here.
Buongiorno, 2 caffè, grazie.
2 caffè al banco?
Sì.
Un caffè lungo macchiato e un caffè normale. Grazie. Coffee here at the bar costs $2.50. This establishment is very grand, truly one of the oldest in Rome. In a regular local bar, a coffee will cost 150 euros, and in some places even just €1, but only at the bar. But if you sit at a table, the price of coffee will be much higher. Here, for example, it's $7.50. So can you imagine that? 3 times as much. The thing is, almost all Italians drink their coffee at the bar. The tradition of drinking espresso on the go was born right here in Italy, and sitting down at a table feels more like Paris or even Vienna. Italians drink an average of 5 cups of coffee a day, so there is basically no time to spend it at a table. By the way, it was right here in this coffee shop that the small coffee cup was invented. During the Napoleonic Wars, extra taxes were introduced and the cost of coffee brought from the colonies skyrocketed. And while other coffee shops in the city started adding chickpeas or chestnuts, here they simply reduced the portions. And this was long before the invention of espresso. Espresso appeared in Italy, but not until the 20th century. And then they started thinking, where should this inexpensive coffee be served? And they remembered the bars. So it's essentially a bancone di ristorante, a restaurant counter. That's why coffee is drunk in cafes all around the world, but in Rome and Italy, it is served in bars. The most interesting thing is that this place was a favorite of Gogol's. It was here, at a small table, that he spent all of his evenings blowing his entire scholarship. It was here that he wrote The Overcoat and even parts of the classic Dead Souls. You can even see a copy of a letter Gogol wrote to Danilevsky on the wall where he said, and I quote, "Only in Rome can I write about Russia. Only here does it appear before me in all its greatness." And on this very little sofa, do you know who used to sit here? Hans Christian Andersen, who also lived nearby. I think I'll go and sit here too. At least the restroom here is decent. The thing is, there are almost no public restrooms in Rome, but the city requires bars to let tourists in, even if they don't order anything. Most tourists don't even know that. But restaurants don't have to let you in, so it turns into a vicious circle. You go for coffee, then to the restroom, then back for coffee, and to the restroom again. And in most bars, honestly, they're pretty ugly. Finding our coffee house, Antico Cafe Greco, is really easy. It's on Rome's Boutique Street, Via Condotti. On Via Condotti, you'll find all the most expensive, famous Italian brands. On the parallel side streets, you'll find the other, less famous brands. And all of this is right next to the Spanish Steps. The Spanish Steps are one of the city's signature landmarks, and we're lucky we've caught them at their most beautiful. At the end of April, they decorate the steps with these azaleas, then they take them away. And the Spanish Steps became a symbol of fashion because it was here in the 90s that they held fashion shows. By the way, Valentino has recently tried to revive this tradition. And at the top is the French Academy of Arts. Technically, it would be more accurate to call them the French Steps. The French built them to connect the square with the French church. But just around the corner is the Spanish embassy, so people started calling both the square and the steps the Spanish Steps. And it was right up there on a little street at the top of the Spanish Steps that Gogol lived for several years. In fact, Gogol lived in Italy for 12 years and wrote all of his best works here. And it's exactly here that I remember his words. All of beautiful Europe is for looking, but Italy is for living. And do you know what he wrote about Rome? You fall deeply in love with Rome slowly and bit by bit, but for a lifetime. So why do you fall in love with Rome slowly, bit by bit? Because Rome, unlike many impressive cities, doesn't show off its beauty. Instead, everything is tucked away in courtyards and along small, narrow streets. The best example is the Trevi Fountain. Lots of tourists can't even find it. And yes, this is the water's real color. The water in the Trevi Fountain is actually drinkable. The aqueduct that brings it here was built back in the 1st century BC. But the fountain itself is much newer. It's from the 18th century. It's one of the last great masterpieces of the Baroque era. And there's a tradition at the Trevi Fountain. Take a coin in your right hand and toss it over your left shoulder. Just imagine, there are so many tourists that they fish out €1.5 million every year. 3 times a week they turn the Trevi Fountain off and a special crew comes to collect all the coins. When we filmed Jana Badoeva's show, The Lives of Others, we even got permission to go into the control room where you can switch the fountain on and off. And here I'll tell you why you shouldn't start a fight with architects. When the Trevi Fountain was being built, the city council was flooded with complaints from a barber whose shop was located right here. He wrote that the architects were noisy, banging around and scaring away his customers. He annoyed the architects so much that they placed this vase here on purpose, so that from his shop counter, not a single figure of the fountain could be seen. And they say that there are many pickpockets in Rome. That's true, but you should be careful in places like this, where there are crowds of people, so keep your bag closed. But on regular streets, where there are no crowds, no one is going to snatch anything from you. Let's get out of here. Run! People always wonder how you can live in a city with so many tourists. First of all, Rome has always had tourists, back in antiquity, in the Middle Ages, and in the 20th century. And secondly, tourists mostly walk between the main attractions. So if you feel caught in the flow, just take the next street over. See, it's already quieter here. But honestly, in Rome, the most beautiful things are hidden in the most ordinary looking places. See these blank walls? Let's go see what's inside. In Rome, the most beautiful things are hidden in the inner courtyards of palaces. You see, Rome has always been loud and chaotic. Most people were poor, and there was this idea, beauty is for the chosen few. So, just like 2,000 years ago, in the 16th century, palaces were built to wall themselves off from the city. A city of suffering, filth, pain, chaos, noise, and sometimes even stench. And today, in most cases, these courtyards are open to us. Tourists? For example, we are in the courtyard of the Palazzo Venezia. This is the first full-fledged Renaissance palace in Rome. Before this, medieval defensive castles were built. But here, as you can see, aesthetics already appear. The Renaissance is the revival of ancient traditions, literally and figuratively. Look, this is nothing more than an imitation of the arches of the Colosseum. And the travertine here was also taken from the Colosseum. And today you can hear the lovely singing of parrots right here. A whole colony of green parrots lives here. Or you can just sit on a bench and take a relaxing break from the noisy city. So let's see what a wealthy Roman house looked like, using the house of the Vestals as our example. Basically, it's a classic domus built around an inner courtyard because the wealthy wanted to shut themselves off from the city's chaos and dirt. From the outside, there were no windows and no doors. The outer rooms were simply rented out as taverns and all kinds of shops. In the middle, they collected rainwater, just for everyday use. All the owners' doors and windows opened onto the inner courtyard. Out here, in this inner courtyard, there's a summer dining room, the triclinium, where they could eat in peace and quiet. And, by the way, Romans ate their meals half sitting, half lying around a small table. And usually the dining couch had 3 sides. That's why it's called a triclinium. Some domuses were only a single story in height, but most were still 2 stories tall. And here, specifically in the house of the Vestals, lived 6 young women who decided to dedicate themselves to the sacred service of Vesta. It was based on the model of such domuses that all Renaissance palaces were built. However, I will show you something remarkable that even during the Renaissance was unavailable in the wealthiest palaces. The Vestals had their own private baths, baths with heated floors. This is the so-called hypocaust system, meaning hot air from the furnace wasn't vented outside, but passed under the floors and even inside the walls through special air tunnels, preventing these rooms from cooling down. It is important to note that these same furnaces heated large boilers of hot water, and the water constantly flowed into the pools. The Romans really did go to the baths every day. But to be honest, no one had private baths in the city center except for the Vestals and the emperor. Even the affluent patricians regularly visited public baths while they were in the busy city center. A lot has been preserved from antiquity. In particular, this street we're walking on, it even still has its Latin name, Clivo. That's what they called perpendicular roads. Even this house next to us has been preserved. This is a multi-apartment, multi-story tenement house, a so-called insula. Ordinary Romans lived in such houses, renting small apartments and rooms here, for colossal money, by the way, but they preferred to live specifically in Rome. On the ground floors here, there were all sorts of taverns, shops, and stalls. Everything was just like now. And it's easy to understand how strong the social stratification was in Rome by remembering just 2 figures. In Rome, there were 1,797 wealthy mansions, or domuses, and 46,602 tenement houses. That means for every single wealthy house, there were approximately 26 such multi-apartment buildings. The only thing is that tens of times more residents lived in such houses. Nothing has changed in 2,000 years. Well, except that now the top floors have the most prestigious apartments with terraces, but before, the poorest layers of Roman society lived there because there were no conditions at all. Water only reached the first floor, and upstairs, as a rule, all the floors were wooden. And here's another ancient Roman insula. Just imagine, back in the 1st century BC, Emperor Octavian Augustus banned buildings taller than 20 meters, so 6 or 7 stories were the maximum. And to get a sense of how cramped life was for most Romans, just look at these corridors. Some rooms didn't even have windows, only so-called wolf windows, a small opening above the doors. The rooms were about 1.5 by 2 meters, so there was space for just a bed and a chest. And for the Romans, it was a safe place where they could come and spend the night. By the way, even today in Rome, apartments and rooms are small pretty much everywhere because Romans are used to not staying at home, but to spend their whole lives out on the city streets, just as they did 2,000 years ago. And notice how much Rome's ground level has changed? So somewhere below us, about 7 meters down, is the street level from the 2nd century. There were all kinds of taverns there. The thing is, all the ground floors in the city were taken up by small shops, workshops, and taverns, which, by the way, were called Thermopolia 2,000 years ago. And the funny thing is, nothing has really changed. It's the same today. In the modern city, all the ground floors are occupied by small shops, fast food places, and tourist stores. All the most interesting things are hidden in the most unusual places. To be honest, if you don't know where to go, you might just walk right past such charming places. Look, there's an ancient column standing right here, by the way. This is a real medieval courtyard. In the Middle Ages, houses looked exactly like this. Here's a little secret foretelling a Renaissance house from a medieval one. If you see a staircase, the building definitely dates to before the 15th century. Later, in the Renaissance, the idea of an inner courtyard appeared, and the staircase moved inside the building. Here, it's as if time has stood still. Or, for example, this courtyard of the Palazzo della Cancelleria, which is rightly considered a model of Roman Renaissance architecture. Just imagine, there's a hall here painted by Giorgio Vasari himself. Vasari used to boast that he finished the frescoes in this hall in just 100 days, until one day Michelangelo couldn't resist and replied, "And it shows." Everything you need to know about Italian men. On this fresco, you can see the female virtues Duke Ciara especially valued. He commissioned it. And among the others, you can spot affection, kindness, and even a touch of dominance. You see, Italian men really value dominance in women. Their men are often called mamoni, which literally means mama's boys. And yes, it is true. Italians live with their mothers until they're 30, many even until 40, which is basically until marriage. And it's so convenient. First, there are no expenses for your own apartment. And second, mothers pamper their sons so much that they even sort their socks by color and cook them delicious meals. And then, unfortunately, Italian men compare their girlfriends and wives to their mothers, and as you can guess, the mothers always win. So the best food is never in a restaurant. It's always at home with mom.
Allora, prendiamo trippa alla romana, poi un carciofo alla romana,
Un carciofo alla giudia.
Carciofo alla giudia.
Ma per caso ci sono rigatoni con pagliata?
Yes.
Allora, rigatoni con pagliata.
Rigatoni con pagliata.
Una coda alla vaccinara.
Coda alla vaccinara.
E le puntarelle in salsa d'alice. And how can you talk about Rome without mentioning Roman cuisine? You might know that every Italian city has its own traditional dishes. So let's explore some of these Roman dishes right now. And while we wait for our order, let's go down to the restaurant's basement. When I say that antiquity surrounds us everywhere, I'm not kidding. Right here, 2,000 years ago, there was the Theater of Pompey. Over there, you can even see its walls from outside. Look, this is a remarkable column from the 1st century BC, and we're actually standing inside the ancient theater, which was built back in the time of Julius Caesar. So I understand that all of this was found here by chance during excavations. By the way, Julius Caesar was killed nearby. Perhaps you remember that on the day of the assassination, the Senate was temporarily meeting in the Curia of Pompey, near this Theater of Pompey. And this is already a modern bust of Julius Caesar to remember this story. Let's try Roman cuisine. We are in a Roman cuisine restaurant. By the way, the Pancrazio restaurant is already over 100 years old. Roman cuisine was always the cuisine of the poor, because wealthy people, aristocrats who were no more than 2%, were always sold the most expensive part of the meat, the filet, the tenderloin. Historically, the poor were usually left with only the offal. Consequently, one of the most famous traditional Roman dishes is tripe, which consists of slowly stewed beef stomachs. Let's try it now. It doesn't look great, but it should be very tasty. Well, to be honest, I know these are stomachs, but when I tried them for the first time, I had no idea. But actually, it's very delicious. Another traditional dish is artichokes. This is a Roman-style artichoke. It is slowly simmered in butter with a blend of spices, and more specifically with Roman mint. Very soft, very tender inside. And in my opinion, this is the healthiest way to prepare an artichoke. And this is the famous so-called Jewish-style artichoke, because the Jewish community people didn't want to mix meat and dairy products. They didn't really like these artichokes in butter. And this artichoke is prepared by dipping it into olive oil. Look, it opens up just like a little flower. It tastes like potato chips. And these artichokes are most loved by children and tourists because the taste doesn't really resemble an artichoke, but rather potato chips. It is very delicious. Guys, I ordered this dish just for you. I've only tried it once in my life, and it's absolutely the most unusual dish in Roman cuisine. It's called pagliata. Pagliata is the unwashed intestines of a milk-fed calf. This means that the chyme stays directly inside. And when I tried it the first time, I didn't know what it was, and I liked it. Then when I found out, I just wanted to spit it all out. But I think that after 15 years, I'm ready to try it for you. Yes, it's pasta. Pasta is the first course. Italians eat all spaghetti, all types of pasta as a first course instead of soup. So today we're having lunch according to Italian tradition, appetizer, pasta, and a main course. Well then, ready? Let's start with just the pasta. The pasta is delicious, al dente, just right, meaning it's slightly undercooked. It is a fine art to cook the perfect pasta so that it's al dente. I am getting myself ready. Delicious, much tastier than I remembered. Either they cook well in this restaurant or my tastes have changed. It's something between pasta with meat and pasta with cheese, because essentially dairy products are cheese. By the way, Roberto joined us for lunch.
Roberto, tu hai mai assaggiato pagliata?
Sì,
La vuoi assaggiare?
no grazie.
Ma è veramente buono.
Ma io
non
mi
sto
fido.
scherzando.
Sì, ma io
Volevo
fa-
sentire la tua opinione.
Ma io so com'è fatta.
Dai, Roberto.
Appunto.
Volevo sentire la tua opinione. È
È
buonissimo.
buonissimo.
Non sto
È buonissimo,
scherzando.
mi credo sulla parola.
There you go. Roberto doesn't want to try it.
Vabbè, il tuo piatto di tradizione romana preferito?
La carbonara.
Of course, Roberto's favorite dish is carbonara. Enjoy your meal. And for the main course, another classic and traditional Roman dish, tender oxtail in a savory tomato sauce. It is stewed for 2.5 hours in a pressure cooker, or 4.5 hours using the traditional method along with tomato sauce, celery, and carrots. And it's really very delicious. By the way, it also has a lot of collagen. Such delicious vegetable broth. I order this dish for myself all the time. And for a side dish, the so-called puntarelle. It's celery stalks with anchovies and garlic, a traditional Roman side dish. And yes, I'm going to eat all of this. I did share the appetizer with my friends, of course. But a typical Italian can handle an appetizer, a first course, a second course, and then still order dessert. Now you probably understand why Italians don't drink cappuccino or other milky drinks after lunch. Want me to show you something interesting? We have to, so let's go. Honestly, the most curious things are tucked away in the darkest alleys. Like this passage between two houses, for example. The frescoes here are amazing. Yes, they're relatively modern, 19th century, but still, that element of surprise when you turn into a dark alley makes it even more interesting. And look, there's a local restorer sitting here, repairing real jewelry, historic antique pieces. Well, and here we can see an entire palace. Yes, this is exactly what a 15th century palace looks like, built directly over the ruins of the ancient theater of Pompeii. That is why it has such a semicircular shape. And right here in my favorite neighborhood where mostly locals live is Rome's main problem and my biggest personal headache, garbage. Basically, someone left this garbage here, hoping someone would drive by and pick it up. Rome has a really big garbage problem because a few years ago they closed the landfill and there's nowhere to take the garbage. So basically, all the money, all the garbage taxes, all the funds, all the effort of the garbage collectors goes not into clearing it off the streets, but into taking it to other regions. And unfortunately, over the next few years, this problem won't be solved in any way. So Rome either has to build an incinerator or open a new landfill, but there's nowhere to put one, people live everywhere, or it's protected nature parkland. And we have the so-called raccolta porta a porta, which means that people who live in the center first sort their garbage separately, and then they put it all out on a certain day, at a certain time, and the garbage collectors don't always pick it up on time, as you can see. And all over Rome you can find plaques like these. The historical plaque clearly states it is strictly forbidden to throw trash under penalty of 20 scudi, which was an incredibly substantial sum of money at the time, representing almost 2 typical monthly wages for a local craftsman. or severe corporal punishment or physical discipline. The year was 1733. In the 18th century, they mercilessly flogged anyone who littered. It's time to bring that back. And even in the city center, where it feels like there are tourists everywhere, locals live here. All of these buildings around me are residential. Living in the center is very prestigious. It's not only princes and aristocrats who live here, but ordinary people too. And of course, they need to buy things somewhere, and besides the markets, there are little shops like these. Let's go inside. Actually, Italians usually buy all their groceries in these little shops. So every day they come and get fresh meat, fresh fish, and there are separate butcher shops, fish shops, and vegetable shops. Oh, look, Roberto is buying us some lamb for dinner.
Quindi è bacchio panato?
Sì, abbacchio panato.
It's going to be breaded lamb. And here we have Campo dei Fiori. It might look like a tourist market, but in the mornings there's one vegetable stall where a signora who's 83 years old works. And she told me she was born here and she wants to die here. This market dates back to the 19th century. Well, as you know, Rome is the eternal city and absolutely nothing changes here, so my favorite sausage shop has been here since the 19th century. By the way, you can come in here and taste something. Right here inside, they make all these sausages. They have a sausage workshop there and a sculpture of an old man with a broken nose. As the local workers say, the old man stuck his nose where it didn't belong, so they broke it off. And you can try the sausages right here. Buongiorno, posso? The sausages here are incredibly tasty, made right here. There's even sausage with Barolo or fennel. Hey, Nastya, do you want a sausage? And these are pork cheeks, carefully cured right here on site. In Rome, instead of using bacon, especially when making traditional pasta dishes, pasta like carbonara or amatriciana, they use these exact pork cheeks.
Prendo le fragole.
Everything here is locally produced. All the fruits and vegetables are Italian. After lunch, they clear everything away, and the square turns into the center of the night scene. People pack into all these pubs. In summer, musicians even play here, and young people gather. Basically, the Square of Flowers is one of the liveliest places in the city center.
E noi attacchiamo adesso a lavorare, però non faccio vedere che vogliamo prima. Esatto. Possiamo bere durante. Quindi prima questo video cancellalo tutto. Va benissimo così. Che abbiamo fatto spendere quei 15 secondi fondamentali.
These 4 letters are everywhere in Rome, on every corner, and that's also a legacy from ancient times. Senatus Populusque Romanus, which means the Senate and the people of Rome. 2,000 years ago, these letters, or even these words, were written on just about every ancient monument. Well, nothing has changed. The ancient Senate of Rome still exists, only today it is the modern municipality. So everything under the municipality's jurisdiction, manhole covers, or even this drain here and various street signs, they are all marked SPQR. So this has also become a very significant part of Roman history. But Romans, with their typical sense of humor, came up with a new abbreviation. Sono porci questi Romani. What pigs these Romans are. I like their sense of humor. As our camera operator Nastya said, every joke has an element of truth in it. And yes, in a way, Romans are a bit like pigs, especially when it comes to looking after their city, or rather, not looking after it. And this is my favorite ice cream shop. You see, they make it here every day from fresh, natural ingredients right in front of everyone. Let's go try some. They have several flavors of chocolate ice cream alone. They've got some very unusual flavors. For example, my favorite is sage with raspberry. And of course the classics too, like pistachio or almond. And there's seasonal ice cream as well. So in pumpkin season they make pumpkin, in melon season they make melon. So let's see what they have today. They also have pink ice cream. This one, for example, is apple and cinnamon. And here's my favorite, sage and raspberry. And there's ice cream made with cottage cheese, figs and almonds.
Lampone salvia e pistacchio. Grazie.
How about a lesson on how you should eat ice cream? It melts quickly since it has no preservatives. You have to lick it all the way around. Here's another secret from the Italians on how to tell at a glance if the ice cream is tasty and natural or not. Take a look at the banana flavor. Bananas don't really have much color. It's not very pleasant. They're kind of grayish. So if the banana ice cream is yellow, it means something's been added, while the natural one will have a grayish tint. History is on every corner. These doors are from the 16th century. Here's another 16th century palace. It also has an incredible inner courtyard, but it's private. They won't let us in today, so sorry. What I love most is walking through narrow streets. Ideally, it should be a historic street like this one from the 16th century. Though there is an ancient column and a palace. By the way, built by Baldassare Peruzzi, a truly great architect. But this is just a regular apartment building. Here's a palace that still belongs to a noble family. There are stunning frescoes on the second floor and these small altars. These are the so-called Madonnelle. Actually, there used to be over 1,000 of them in Rome. Only 500 remain today. And this is also a legacy of ancient Rome. 2,000 years ago, the Romans were afraid of crossroads, and at every intersection they set up small altars. Romans believed evil spirits lived at crossroads. Fighting them was useless, and those spirits, they thought, had to be appeased. Later, in the 4th century, Rome officially converted to Christianity, and making offerings to demons and devils was no longer seen as appropriate. And that is why they started putting up these altars. In the 15th and 16th centuries, they were turned into true works of art that still beautifully adorn the city of Rome today. In Rome, drinking water flows everywhere, both from the tap and in all the fountains. Well, for the convenience of tourists and locals, so-called little noses are scattered across the city. Now I'm going to show you how to use them. It's delicious. This water flows through the ancient Roman aqueducts. Just imagine, even 2,000 years ago, drinking fountains were scattered all across the city. And the water here is so fresh and pure, it comes from the mountains. You can't even buy this in a bottle. Actually, the tradition of drinking fountains also has its roots in ancient Rome. Can you imagine, 2,000 years ago, Rome had as many as 11 aqueducts. By the way, one of them is right behind my back. Out of the 11, 4 aqueducts are still in operation today. Of course, they've been restored, but in some fountains you can taste this mountain water, just like in ancient Rome. In general, the length of the aqueducts is 20 to 100 kilometers. It's a truly magnificent masterpiece of architecture. And the water flow from 2,000 years ago is so sophisticated it can be compared to the modern water flow in more or less large cities, such as Rome. In some ancient aqueducts, the water was drinkable, while in others, it was not. And local Romans, those born right here who've been drinking fresh water for many years from these aqueducts, can even tell exactly which specific aqueduct the water is coming from in any given public drinking fountain. It's been a while since we've had a coffee. Let's go get some coffee, and not just at any cafe, but at Sant'Eustachio. They really have the city's most delicious coffee here. By the way, the Senate building is right across the street, and in the morning senators come here for coffee because the coffee in their building is just ordinary. This coffee shop was opened in 1938, and since then they've been serving authentic Roman coffee right here. Actually, it's brought in from all over the world, from Cuba, from Brazil, from Guatemala, and from somewhere else too. All of this is mixed in specific proportions and roasted over a wood fire. As a matter of fact, it's not so much the Italian coffee machine that's famous, but the traditional Italian roasting method. Due to the dark roast, Roman coffee is not particularly strong in terms of caffeine, but it is very strong in terms of its flavor profile. So let's save some money and have our coffee at the bar. First we go pay for the coffee at the register, and then we take the receipt to the barista. Well, when there are so many people here, the rule is whoever shouts the loudest gets their coffee first.
Ciao. Buongiorno. Un caffè, grazie.
Il sole sulle.
Paesi. Grazie a lei.
Due caffè.
And if you ask an Italian for coffee, they won't ask you what kind of coffee you want. To them, the only type of coffee that exists is espresso. Over there, there's even a photo of Kissinger drinking coffee right here. They make the coffee here with foam. It's their thing. I, of course, ordered a cafe macchiato, which is just a drop of milk, but you can clearly see that rich coffee foam right there. I'll tell you a little secret. They whip it up separately and just add it on top. Every time they prepare the coffee behind a screen. It's very delicious, a truly life-giving drink. It's actually quite noisy in Rome. This is a city that has always been this way, so you better get used to the high decibels. Actually, the symbol of this coffee shop is quite unusual, a deer with antlers. It's all because of this church where nobody wants to get married. There are real antlers there. For an Italian, horned is the most terrible insult. If you want to pick a fight with an Italian, just call him cornuto. But in reality, the church is actually dedicated to Saint Eustace, the patron saint of all hunters. And you have probably already seen this symbol on a bottle of Jägermeister, because Jägermeister is also a traditional hunter's drink. The thing is, Saint Eustace converted to Christianity while hunting. He cornered a stag, was about to shoot it, and at that moment, he saw a crucifix between its antlers. And instead of the stag, Jesus appeared before him. So now you know what you'll be drinking the next time you order a Jägermeister. But without a doubt, the most important monument of antiquity is the Pantheon, the temple of all gods, and the only ancient temple that remains active to this day. While all other pagan temples around were being taken apart, piece by piece, the Pantheon stood unshakable. The thing is, back in the 7th century, it was gifted to the Pope, and the Pope has cared for the Pantheon as a church all this time, preserving it to this day. If you look closely, you can see an inscription that tells us it was built by Marcus Agrippa in the 3rd year of his consulship. But to be honest, there were fires in Rome, and almost nothing from that time has survived. Rome was completely rebuilt in the 1st and 2nd centuries, so what we see here is 2nd century architecture. Let's go inside and take a look. The most important thing about the Pantheon is that its ancient interior has been preserved. Take a look at these beautiful doors. These doors are nearly 2,000 years old. They open and close consistently every single day, and it only takes one person to open or close them. That is how well the gravity is balanced. But most importantly, we are standing directly on the original ancient Roman flooring. This marble is nearly 2,000 years old. I am currently standing on red porphyry. This is the so-called imperial stone, so we can conclude that something here was related to the emperor. We do not know for sure who was worshipped here, but it was likely the center of the imperial cult. That is why no expense was spared on the Pantheon's finish. It is the largest and most massive monolithic dome in the world to this day. This means it was cast directly from concrete, without any internal metal structures or a reinforcing frame. And why the Pantheon has stood all this time is quite explainable. An arch is the strongest structure. A 3D arch is an eternal one. The dome is shaped like a perfect hemisphere. By the way, the Pantheon's height and width are also identical. A sphere could fit perfectly inside it. By intentionally engineering this circular opening, the Romans successfully bypassed the critical point of maximum pressure, giving the Pantheon eternal life. All the world's domes were meticulously modeled after this dome of the Pantheon. Even the great Brunelleschi was inspired by it. He too found his inspiration right here in the Pantheon. Though there is a legend. They say the Pantheon was filled with sand from the inside, and the dome was cast on this sand form. And they say that Roman architects were extremely clever, so they put several gold coins in every cubic meter. And when the dome was finished, the emperor announced that whoever needed gold should go and take it. And the city's population, over 1 million people then, took all that gold home along with the sand. They didn't even have to decide where to put the mountain of sand. It's fascinating that even the Pantheon's interior finish has survived. These columns, these pilasters, and the marble wall finishes are 1,900 years old. Now that's how you build a house. The only things that were modified are these niches behind the columns. Of course, sculptures of Roman gods once stood right here. And by the way, remember, many emperors were officially deified by the Romans and were later worshipped. And of course, when the Pantheon became a Christian church, all of that was turned into lime. In medieval Rome, the magnificent marble bas-reliefs and sculptures were all converted into lime, and the Romans did this with satisfaction, as they firmly believed these sculptures served as offerings for demons and evil spirits. Well, and today, what are called pantheons? Do you remember? They are frequently used as burial sites because here in the original Pantheon, very famous individuals are buried. First of all, this includes all the kings of Italy. Victor Emmanuel II, Padre della Patria, the father of the fatherland, the very one who unified Italy. By the way, the eagle here has nothing to do with Nazism or fascism. Rather, it relates to ancient Rome. You remember that everything has its origins in antiquity. The eagle is an ancient Roman symbol of power. It was even placed on the standards of the legions. The thing is, the eagle carried the arrows of Jupiter, or Zeus in the Greek style, which meant it symbolized power for the Romans. Umberto, his son, and Margherita of Savoy, after whom the Margherita pizza was named. But in my personal opinion, the most important thing here is the tomb of Raphael, that very great and influential artist, Raphael Sanzio. Right here, in an ancient sarcophagus, lie his remains, and a most beautiful phrase is written on the sarcophagus. In this place rests Raphael, during whose life Mother Nature herself feared being outdone, and with whose death she truly feared that she too would perish. Raphael died quite young, at the age of only 37, but back in those days people lived to 35 on average, and he died unmarried, though he had a long-time fiancée, and he even willed for her to be buried nearby his side. They hadn't officially sworn their vows before God, so the Pope personally ensured her bust was removed from his tomb. But the original inscription remains there to this day. Maria Bibbiena Sposa, meaning fiancée, not even his wife. But Raphael truly loved his sweetheart, his muse, La Fornarina, who was the baker's daughter. It was from her that he created many of his works. The Woman with the Veil, Galatea, the Sistine Madonna, the Madonna of Foligno. And it was her, apparently, he loved until the end of his days. So he asked one of his students to depict the Virgin Mary with the face of this baker's daughter above his tomb, because in any other case, all of this would have been censored, her face and her name would have been removed. And the Madonna is a great way to avoid censorship. But it's most interesting here on the day of Pentecost. Then rose petals fall from this opening, which symbolizes the descent of the Holy Spirit. This is the moment when the Holy Spirit descended upon the apostles, and they began to speak in all the languages of the world. By the way, there is no glass above us at all. All the water falls onto the floor and drains away through the ancient sewer system, the Cloaca Maxima of the 6th century BC. It's still in operation and still carries away all the rainwater from the Roman streets. I decided not to talk about the Vatican in this video. This topic is so complex that it's impossible to cover in 5 minutes. But we have to understand that for 1500 years, it was the popes who ruled Rome. And in general, all the city's architecture is also linked to the popes. The papal coat of arms is on every corner. And even the streets at first glance seem to be scattered all over the place. In reality, though, they connect the Roman churches to one another. That's why in Rome, everyone uses the churches as landmarks. So when you ask someone, where do you live? They say, by San Giovanni, meaning near the church of San Giovanni in Laterano, and religion still exerts a massive influence on the city today. There are lots of monasteries here. Many nuns, monks, and priests all live here. The city's main Catholic university is situated here, and this quiet life flows in parallel, usually hidden away behind closed walls. To see it for yourself, you either have to knock on all those doors or go up to the terraces. So why do we see the papal coat of arms everywhere? The thing is, for centuries, Rome was the capital of the papal states. The Pope was like a powerful monarch. Well, imagine that he governed a state and actively took part in various wars. By the way, back then they elected popes who could defend their country's interests, not the most virtuous one. Actually, Italy is a relatively young nation. After the fall of the Roman Empire, all power was consolidated in the hands of the Pope, and the entire center of Italy from the 7th to the 19th century was the papal state. So, the Pope was essentially a monarch here and looked after the interests of his own state. All these small countries fought each other periodically and certainly competed. By the way, that's exactly why every city and region here has its own dialect, its own dishes, and its own unique mentality. There was significantly more separate history than shared history. Italy was unified in the year 1861, and it was precisely this very king from Piedmont, Victor Emmanuel II, who did that. Well, to be fair, Garibaldi helped him from the south. The nation of Italy was officially created that year, and in 1870 Rome was annexed, or essentially conquered. When the royal troops finally took the city, the Pope decided on a bloodless surrender. So no actual war took place at that moment, but actually the Romans all viewed Victor Emmanuel II as an invader. So when this magnificent structure was built in the late 19th century, absolutely nobody liked it. First, it was seen as contemporary architecture for its time. The effect was similar to, say, Paris from the Eiffel Tower. They demolished a magnificent, intimate, and authentic medieval quarter to build, as the Romans put it, this massive building. And secondly, he was an outsider and a foreigner after all, and the monument wasn't built from Roman travertine, but instead from northern marble. So, how did the monument go down in history? The typewriter, the dentures, the wedding cake. And yes, in case you haven't guessed, the King's Monument isn't just the man on the horse, but the entire white building. Mind you, it's built into a hill, so there's almost nothing inside. Mussolini gave the monument a new meaning. His government was located right across the street. He moved the tomb of the unknown soldier here, lit the eternal flame, and began calling the monument the altar of the fatherland. But today, all of Rome and all of Italy see it specifically as a monument to the unified kingdom. So, let's forgive its presence. And it was Mussolini who built this road leading straight to the Colosseum. He was also the one who conducted excavations at the Roman Forum. It was very important for Mussolini to uncover and show all of Italy the former glory of Rome. He invoked the greatness of the past to hint at the greatness that he himself could lead to. And standing right here in this spot in Piazza Venezia, you can see a plaque commemorating that Michelangelo lived and died here. In fact, Michelangelo himself liked to say that he went to school every single day. What could have served as a school for the great sculptor and architect? The Roman Forum, of course. He studied elements of ancient Roman architecture every single day, right there next to his home.
Yes, this is exactly how the Roman Forum looks today. But to imagine what it was like 2,000 years ago, you'd need a truly vivid imagination. So right here is a video from my talented friends from the History in 3D project.
The Roman Forum is the main square of Rome. It was the political, cultural, and spiritual center. The main state institutions were here, the Basilica Julia, where legal matters were decided. Nearby was the Basilica, where all economic matters were decided. Here, in the square, the popular assembly would gather. A representative was elected from each group of Romans, so everyone indirectly participated in all state affairs. The rostra were here, from where all the orators would speak. The curia was also here, where the Senate would meet. So essentially this was the very center of Rome, but then Rome was destroyed. In the 6th century, barbarians destroyed all the aqueducts, and these lands were abandoned. Simple cowsheds and pigsties appeared here. And naturally, only those with nothing to lose remained behind in the city. Runaway slaves, criminals, and the most impoverished people. And they moved to live much closer to the Tiber. The Pantheon area and Piazza Navona are the heart of the center, including the modern city today. But in general, the history of Rome began right on this hill, on the Palatine Hill. It was there that Romulus founded his first city, and the wealthiest residents of the city lived later on. And it was there that the first complex of imperial palaces appeared. The very word palace itself, palazzo, is derived from the ancient name of this hill, the Palatine. Well, you have already realized the Romans themselves inflicted more destruction upon Rome than the barbarians or any other conquerors. The Romans took all the ancient temples apart piece by piece because to them these temples were dedicated to devils and demons. In the 4th century, the Romans became Christians. And you can see that they even tried to destroy this temple of Antoninus and his wife Faustina, even making grooves to pull down the columns with mules. Well, when they found they couldn't demolish the massive structures, they used the existing walls and columns of the ancient temple to build a Christian church. And all the luxurious bas-reliefs and magnificent sculptures were ground down into lime because a vast amount of lime was needed for creating Roman concrete. Roman concrete was 5 times stronger than modern concrete. Actually, we know its recipe. It's pozzolana, which is volcanic ash, burnt lime, and sand. But nobody uses it today because it was very expensive, and it's still expensive to this day. So we can still see the original ancient Roman walls today, which were made of brick and solid concrete. By the way, in ancient Rome, no one ever saw these plain brick walls. Everything was covered with marble, or at the very least with frescoes. Rome's cultural layer has grown by an average of 7 meters, more in some places, less in others. That's why we talk about excavations. Over the centuries, the layer of ground has preserved the cultural heritage of ancient Rome until today. Everything we see was excavated again under Mussolini only in the 20th century. Why exactly did this happen? Well, it occurred mostly because of human activities. Let's examine how it happened back in ancient Rome. Look, I am standing on a road from the 1st century BC, and right next to it, you can see a 2nd century road. This doesn't mean that in 3 centuries the cultural layer grew in some unimaginable way. It means that the city was rebuilt many times. And first of all, the construction of a new quarter or a new monument began with leveling. So it happened that in the modern-day city, medieval churches ended up several meters deep. In other words, the city grew by itself. All roads lead to Rome, as the famous saying goes. By the way, I'm walking right now on such an ancient Roman road. The thing is, the Romans built their roads everywhere. By various estimates, their combined total length is from approximately 80,000 to as many as 300,000 kilometers. So, if we could put them in a single line, they could wrap around the entire globe several times over. And naturally, these roads went from Rome to other cities of the empire. Every mile, they would place a milestone column. By the way, a Roman mile is nothing other than 1,000 Roman paces, mille. That's where the phrase grazie mille comes from. But they counted the Roman stride, the military stride, which is a step on 1 foot. In our terms, that is approximately 2,000 steps. And here before us is kilometer zero, from where all these miles were measured and where a bronze column once proudly stood, which was meticulously inscribed with the distances from Rome to other provincial cities in miles. The ancient Roman sewage system still runs right beneath us to this day. This is the so-called Cloaca Maxima, the Great Sewer, which was originally built way back in the 6th century BC. And in its earliest days, it served primarily to drain the swamps that were once located where the Roman Forum now stands today. But later on, first they started to direct wastewater there, then water from fountains, and eventually water from toilets. Yes, in ancient Rome, public toilets were everywhere, and several people would relieve themselves at the same time. There were seats, and beneath the seats ran a gutter with constantly flowing water, so these toilets didn't even smell. And nearby, in a small cistern of water, there were sticks with sea sponges on top, and these sponges were used instead of toilet paper. But the question of whether they were single-use or reusable, which is more likely, remains open to this day. Initially, these public toilets were absolutely free of charge. Emperor Vespasian, the same one who began building the Colosseum, introduced a fee for using the toilets. He also actually introduced a tax on the sale of urine. The thing is that the Romans didn't have laundry detergent and used urine to wash their clothes. And his son, of course, began to reproach his father. It's not fitting for the empire's greatest man to fill the treasury through toilets. After which, the father took his son into the state treasury and asked, "Does it smell?" No, you see, money has no smell. That's how the famous expression was born. Rich people, of course, weren't obliged to use public toilets. As a rule, they had separate toilets in their homes. Right here, for example, was the toilet of Emperor Domitian. This is actually located halfway. The room is situated between the Roman Forum and his palace. I think that's the modern-day equivalent of a bathroom. Here we are walking along an ancient road past ancient walls, and we see these grooves. What could they possibly mean? It means that 2,000 years ago, a shop was located here. Wooden doors were placed in these grooves to close the shop for the night, and then they would put a huge latch on top, just like in modern times. In the 2nd century, space in the Roman Forum in the city center became even smaller, so Emperor Trajan decided to move all the shops, building the world's first shopping mall. Trajan's markets are the prototype for all modern shopping centers. So as you can see, there were shops located right there, and an entire floor was dedicated to a food court. Street food shops, taverns, or as we call them, thermopolia. So you see, today Romans live in the same kind of buildings they lived in 2,000 years ago. The only thing that has changed is the colors. In ancient Rome, absolutely everything was painted. The sculptures, the hair color, even the eyes of the statues. And this column here was also colorful. It's almost 2,000 years old. It's Trajan's column. The bas-reliefs are preserved here, but unfortunately the colors didn't last. They won't restore them, of course, because the Italian approach to restoration is to preserve as much as possible of what has survived in its original form. And you can find a new column at the Rome Film Studio. By the way, this basilica was restored with money from Usmanov. He allocated the funds even before the war. And yes, it's a basilica. A basilica is not a church. It was a public institution in ancient Rome. That is, assemblies were held in basilicas, deals were made, other important state events took place, and this restoration gives us an idea of its size. It was only later that churches began to be called basilicas. If they had the same architecture as the ancient Roman basilica, one main nave and two side aisles. And this is the most common Roman ornament. Do you know what it represents? These are bull's testicles. Literally, bull's testicles were a symbol of fertility, abundance, and wealth. And this ornament was used to decorate many Roman monuments 2,000 years ago. Well, it's interesting that to this day architects use this ornamental element, though no longer thinking about what it actually means. The temple of the goddess of love, Venus. Actually, they say that Rome is the city of love. According to a legend, Romulus and Remus were twins. These legendary founders of the city of Rome were distant descendants of the goddess of love. And indeed, if you read the city's name in Latin backwards, it spells the word amor. So Rome really is the city of love. Well, on the other hand, Romulus and Remus were also the children of the god Mars, the god of war. Therefore, the Roman Empire is, of course, an empire of war. The history of Rome begins with blood, see? Romulus slew his brother Remus. And the magnificent greatness of Rome was also built upon blood, on wars of conquest. The Romans conquered the entire Mediterranean Sea. But to tell you the truth, they didn't need it to delineate new borders, but to collect taxes from these provinces. All the wealth of the Mediterranean was already concentrated in one place by the 1st century, Rome. And what we see right here was constructed exactly with that money. By the way, this temple was built by Julius Caesar. He was certain that the blood of Romulus and Remus flowed in his veins, and thus the blood of the goddess Venus and the god Mars. Perhaps that's why he considered himself close to God, and why he surely refused to step down as dictator. In the time of Julius Caesar, Rome was ruled by the Senate. 2 consuls were elected, changing every year so that power wouldn't stay in anyone's hands for long. And the Senate granted dictatorial powers for 6 months, essentially for the duration of a war, so that a general could make quick decisions without looking back at the Senate's opinion. Well, Julius Caesar, upon arriving in Rome, continued to remain a dictator. And he was killed precisely because they believed he wanted to put an end to the Republic. In fact, for the Romans, the word king was offensive. They considered it to be true barbarism, and Caesar compared himself to Alexander the Great. Right here in the Roman Forum, a monument was erected to Caesar on a horse. And that horse had 5 toes, which was just like the famous horse of Alexander the Great, Bucephalus. By the way, have you ever wondered what the word republic actually means? Res publica literally means a public matter, a state that truly belongs to the people. And here it is, the Curia, where the Senate held its sessions for several centuries. Still, for most people, Rome is primarily associated with the Colosseum. By the way, it was recently recognized as one of the 7 modern wonders of the world. So let's take a look at it from the inside. We're going to enter through the entrance reserved specifically for the emperor. It was decorated in the most luxurious way, the stucco technique, which was also painted in various colors. This is the original finish, which has miraculously survived. You have to realize that 2,000 years ago, everything was colorful here, but the paints haven't reached us today. The Colosseum is the largest amphitheater in the world. It held more than 50,000 people, and it's almost 2,000 years old. They started building the Colosseum in 72, and by 80, it was already officially opened. Yes, the Colosseum is a magnificent architectural monument. Its height is 50 meters, and its diameter is 188 meters. But at the same time, it's also a symbol of the bloody customs of ancient Rome. You generally need to understand that the Colosseum was built for gladiatorial games. And there were one-on-one battles here, group against group. There were battles with animals and even executions. The most vile criminals who were not citizens were executed right here in the arena. Roman citizens could only be executed in a dignified manner by beheading outside the city walls so that no one would see. Well, the structure of the Colosseum has been preserved almost entirely. This brick and this concrete are original. If the Colosseum had been built only of travertine, it would have collapsed under its own weight. And only then, on top of this foundational framework of brick and cement, they carefully constructed the marble stands where the spectators would sit. And it's interesting that modern stadiums are still built based on the model of the Colosseum. Inside the Colosseum, every archway was carefully numbered and people held season tickets, where they could easily identify exactly which arch they were allowed to enter through. Each arch led only to a specific and unique designated sector. That is, the first rows were reserved for senators. Next came the patricians, noble Roman citizens. Then came the wealthy plebeians. They were known as the equestrians. This is the prototype of medieval knights. Then there were ordinary plebeians, and at the very top were standing places for slaves and foreigners. Yes, foreigners were equated in status to slaves because they did not have Roman citizenship, and all the performances took place in the arena. The arena was wooden because there was a whole world beneath it. Animals were placed here 2 days before the battle. Gladiators also entered the arena from the dungeons. The gladiator barracks are connected to the Colosseum by an underground tunnel through which they passed during the games and got up by elevators. It was first and foremost a show, a performance. The Romans didn't perceive these bloody battles as murder at all because it wasn't citizens being killed. For the most part, gladiators were, of course, slaves, and slaves were not people. In the opinion of the Romans, slaves were merely property. And the expression blood and sand is quite fitting. The thing is, sand was sprinkled on top of the wooden arena so as not to slip on the blood, and blood here simply flowed like a river. It was then collected with sponges and sold to the wealthy. It was believed to be an excellent remedy for epilepsy and cowardice. Rome's bright sun has always been a major issue. 2,000 years ago, they would stretch extremely large canvas sunshades over the Colosseum to shield spectators from the scorching sun. Well, to be honest, this did not happen very often because games were typically held once a year or every 2 years. For great military victories or to honor an emperor, entry to the Colosseum was free for everyone. You surely remember the famous phrase, bread and circuses. Bread was given for free to all Roman citizens, and spectacles were free too. As long as the emperor had the people's support, the senators' opinions could be ignored. In general, the Colosseum is, of course, a symbol of the greatness of imperial power. It was even called the Flavian Amphitheater. That's the official name of the two great emperors who originally built it. And essentially, it was nothing more than grand propaganda for the absolute power of a specific emperor who spent truly colossal amount of money on these games. The Romans even wiped out part of the animal population in southern Africa. That's how massive these games were throughout the Roman Empire. By the way, I'm standing here on marble-paved floors on an original fragment. This is the exact place where the senators used to walk. This was the lower level, so everything was finished in fine, real Carrara marble. Actually, the Romans themselves caused more damage to the Colosseum than the barbarians. For centuries, it was used as a source of building materials. Half of the Roman churches of that time were built from travertine that was taken directly from the Colosseum. The Pope put an end to its dismantling by declaring the Colosseum a place of martyrdom. But in fact, if mass executions were held here, it's logical to assume that executions of Christians from the 1st century were also held here. Though, to be honest, not a single piece of historical evidence for this has been found yet. Let's just say that's how the tradition developed. And everyone always asks what those holes in the Colosseum are for. In fact, every hole has its own story. For example, animals were tied up right here during the Middle Ages. So you see, the games in the Colosseum ended in the 6th century, and it stood useless right in the city center. There was even a residential house here at one point. And after an earthquake in the Middle Ages, a piece of the Colosseum collapsed, and the Romans saw that the huge marble blocks were linked by metal rods. And many of the holes date back to this time, when Romans simply made holes to extract those metal rods. In the Middle Ages, metal was especially valued because it was needed to create weapons. Later, the Colosseum was used for all sorts of things. It was once a pasture. For a while, the Colosseum even housed a hospital and a manure storage facility. Many of these neat little holes actually date back to that period. And one day in the future, they'll tell stories about how we in the 20th century created even more holes in these ancient stone walls just to install these metal grates. Rome is truly packed with people, especially near famous landmarks like the Colosseum, but it has always been this way. Can you imagine? Even 2,000 years ago, it was officially forbidden by law to use any form of transport in the city center during the day, because the carts and the crowds of people simply could not all possibly fit on the narrow streets of Rome. 2,000 years ago, the population of Rome had already surpassed 1 million people. And perhaps now the decision of the Rome municipality to close the city center to cars will even seem historically justified to you. One of the symbols of Rome could even be called the moped, and there really are a lot of them here. The thing is, you can't drive into the city center without a special permit. Official permits are issued to taxi drivers or the residents of these particular central neighborhoods. But the ban doesn't apply to motorcycles and scooters, so you can go anywhere, park for free, and insurance coverage is inexpensive as well. But I still prefer electric scooters. And this is a symbol of the entire Italian car industry. The Fiat 500, a little car that's over 50 years old. It was the first car that was affordable for ordinary citizens. And even today, these cars are still all over the city. All parking in Rome is paid, but to be honest, finding a parking spot for €1 an hour is true luck. That's why people literally fight over parking spaces here. I'll be honest, there were a couple of times after parking where I actually had to climb all the way out through the trunk. So I specifically bought a car where the trunk opens automatically with a button, just so I can get out and back in the same way. Actually, the embankment in Rome doesn't really deserve much attention. The thing is, these roads only appeared in the 19th century in order to protect Rome from flooding. In the past, the river would overflow its banks periodically, sometimes rising by several meters. So today, the embankment is often several meters above the level of 16th century Rome. Well, okay, authentic Italian dishes can also be found in Rome. So in Rome, no one actually eats paella hand oxtails every single day. There are lots of seafood restaurants, lots of general Italian restaurants. But we have one peculiarity in Italy. You should have coffee in a coffee shop, ice cream in a gelateria, desserts in some pastry shop. Naturally, you should have Roman dishes in a Roman restaurant, seafood in a seafood place, meat in a meat place, and pizza in a pizzeria. So we're going for lunch to a pizzeria in the Trastevere neighborhood, a neighborhood famous for its home-style restaurants and amazing atmosphere.
Allora, una boscaiola,
Sì.
un supplì,
Una boscaiola, un supplì, sì.
una birra piccola
Una birra piccola.
e un'insalata trelossa e una bottiglia d'acqua naturale.
Perfetto.
Una domanda, la vostra non è la pizza romana?
Né romana né napoletana, è una via di mezzo.
Va bene, grazie.
Pizza is, of course, a symbol of Italian cuisine. But few people know that there are two types of pizza. Roman pizza with a thin, crispy crust, and Neapolitan pizza with a thick crust. It is softer, as Italians say. Gommosa, it's more rubbery. And if you can't decide which pizza you want to try in Rome, you can come to the Dar Poeta restaurant, where the pizza is half Roman and half Neapolitan. The classic of Italian pizza is, of course, Margherita, the pizza that Queen Margherita of Italy liked so much that they gave it her name. Well, that's very Italian, not naming a city or a street, but a dish. The thing is, Margherita resembles the flag of Italy, mozzarella, basil, and tomato, but to be honest, I prefer pizza without tomato sauce. And pizza is usually served uncut here, so we cut it ourselves. And yes, it's not bad manners to drink beer with pizza. Italians typically eat their pizza with either beer or, in extreme cases, sparkling water or Coca-Cola. And wine is already reserved for formal restaurant dishes. And by the way, pizza is traditionally eaten with your hands. And yes, in Italy, they order 1 pizza per person. Any Italian can eat not only a whole pizza, but also appetizers. Well, even I can easily eat a whole pizza. The secret of any pizza is, first of all, the dough. Real pizza must rest for 24 to 48 hours. And the tastiest pizza is in the most unremarkable places. Tourists often tell me that pizza in Moscow or somewhere else is tastier because they only eat in fancy restaurants. But pizza is food for the poor. It originated as food for the poor. So, on a plain paper tablecloth, they'll serve you a truly delicious pizza. The most important thing is that it's freshly made in an oven, a real traditional wood-fired one. And there are very few places where you can eat pizza for lunch because that oven needs to heat up for several hours. And let's try another Roman dish. It's a rice croquette with mozzarella inside. It's called supplì. Because when the French came to Rome, they started eating these rice croquettes. They'd open them and say, "Supplì, surprise!" By the way, remember that Celentano movie where they talked like on a phone? And these supplì are served specifically in pizzerias. This Trastevere district is interesting for its osterias. Do you even know the difference between an osteria, a restaurant, and a tavern? An osteria used to be a place where alcohol was served. Imagine, whole families lived in these tiny apartments. And of course, for the head of the family, the man, it was impossible to socialize with friends or drink in those tiny flats, so they went out for wine to an osteria. The owners of these establishments very quickly realized that if they served snacks with the wine, salty snacks, people would drink more. And over time, the osteria became the simplest kind of place where simple homemade dishes are served without fancy service. A tavern is already a level higher, but it also has homemade food and very, very basic service. And restaurants back then were those places with white tablecloths where everything was served to you in white gloves. Well, the thing is that in the 21st century, all these traditions no longer apply. The lines have blurred. And for example, Italy's most famous restaurant with 3 Michelin stars is called Osteria Francescana, though you can imagine what the service is like there. It's believed that authentic Romans live in historic Trastevere. Even the famous Roman songs, the Roman folk songs, are called canzoni trasteverin, which means songs from the Trastevere district. And indeed, it's not just these cute cats living here, but everyday Roman citizens as well. The thing is, on the other side of the Tiber, that's where the palaces are, where the richest individuals lived, while the hardworking common people lived right here. And these little houses from the 15th and 16th centuries have been preserved to this day. That's why there's such an authentic atmosphere here. And look, various cars are passing by, because people actually live here. To be honest, living in Rome is inconvenient. Rome is a city that does not even make a slight effort to be convenient. Rome reminds me of an exceptionally gifted and brilliant artist who creates, who delights everyone with their work, but who is also very difficult to deal with in everyday life. So I can say that there are many different problems in Rome. Well, like any major metropolis, there are heavy traffic issues, jams, and parking challenges, which basically doesn't exist. They say that in Rome, you don't find parking, you invent it. There are problems with public transport that barely works, and it's overcrowded. And of course, the trash. Look, 2 more cats are lying there. Laundry consistently dries outside because there is minimal light inside and very high humidity. And even if you don't see this laundry while walking around Rome, keep in mind it's definitely drying in a courtyard. Even in modern houses, there are courtyards everywhere. That's why we see these houses built right next to each other. And while Varlamov was saying, "What are you talking about? Nobody builds like that anymore," you have to understand that these are all buildings that are 500 or even 600 years old. Sometimes, for example, even palaces are completely unrecognizable from the outside. You're just walking along and you see some old building with peeling plaster covered in ivy. And then you peek inside and there's a truly stunning courtyard, even with an ancient sarcophagus. Take a look in there. Actually, to be honest, you're not allowed into the courtyards of palaces, but we'll give it a try. This is an apartment building, and there's a notary's office here. Not only have the frescoes been well preserved here, but the entire courtyard. There are actually 2 of them, but it's all private residential property, so we won't disturb the local residents.
Però riprendiamolo,
A local resident just passed by, likely a count, because he said, "This palace is mine, it's very beautiful." To be honest, in Rome, all these titles, counts, princes, were officially abolished. But in fact, all these aristocrats still live in Rome. They still all socialize with each other, they still live in their palaces, and for them, losing their real estate is the ultimate disgrace. And they socialize in so-called circolo chiuso. It's something like a private members club. By the way, an elderly gentleman approached us today and offered to take us to see one of those circolo places. But I didn't really want to spend the whole evening with him, so sorry, no circolo this time. And here, even the frescoes on the palace have been preserved. This is 16th century decoration. Indeed, most of the palaces at that time were decorated on the outside with such magnificent paintings. You can see there's a courtyard here. Actually, this entire building is a palace. It has several courtyards. I know for sure because I recently looked at an apartment for sale here. We even wanted to buy it even for $500,000, but it was just too dark. Though, of course, it's always been my dream to live on Via Giulia. Want me to show you this little street? Let's go. The doors here are truly colossal in size, but not because people were giants, but so that a carriage could drive in. And for people, there are these little doors. If I had bought an apartment here, then of course I would let you in. Look, there's such a nice courtyard. The apartment we looked at even had its own private courtyard. Here it is, this little street, Via Giulia. Well, it's truly unique. One of the most aristocratic streets because all the palaces are preserved. People still live here and tourists hardly ever wander in. And actually the anti-mafia committee is also located here. This street is straight. It was created that way in the 16th century as an avenue. So imagine, back in the 16th century, the number of travelers and pilgrims was so huge that they had to create a street where walking was prohibited. You could only arrive by carriage. Rome isn't just the historical city center. There are also ordinary residential neighborhoods. After all, about 2,700,000 people have to live somewhere. They look something like this. Yes, they can be charming or they can be unattractive, but I won't waste your time on simple, everyday residential areas or concrete blocks. Instead, I'll show you a uniquely beautiful neighborhood that truly deserves your attention. This is the Copedi district. The Copedi district is an example of the Liberty style, specifically the Roman Italian Liberty. It is called Copedi because it was designed and built by the magnificent architect Gino Copedi, who was most likely a Freemason. On top of that, at that time, the city's mayor was not only a Mason, but also the Grand Master of the Masonic Order. So it's no surprise that to this day, a huge number of legends is associated with this district. And there really are a lot of esoteric symbols here. I don't mean to say the Masons knew all the secrets of life, so searching for its meaning here is useless, but the symbolism is quite fascinating. Look, even at the entrance, this huge mask here symbolizes, as it were, the beginning of our journey, the path to the light. We can see it right there written on the fresco to the right. You can see a knight on a white horse, and with what? Yes, of course, with the Holy Grail. There's so much symbolism here that entire books have actually been written about this neighborhood. But let's go and see its beauties. Many movies are filmed here. As expected, the Virgin Mary with the Child is here. You remember that such altars were placed on all the corners of the buildings? And over here, there's even the architect's signature. This is actually the main masterpiece of his entire life. And wow, there are even some free parking spaces here. But in general, there aren't many apartments here. These apartments were extremely progressive. First of all, a garage was provided here. Back in the early 20th century, when a car was far from being in every wealthy family, this neighborhood was originally built for ambassadors, for rich people, and for the bourgeoisie that had emerged at that time. Another innovation was the fact that in every single apartment, absolutely everyone, there was a toilet and a bathroom. In Rome, at the beginning of the 20th century, this was unheard of. Do you know who once took a dip in this fountain? The Beatles went for a swim fully clothed because they just left a club located literally in the building next door. And that's how the fountain went down in history. And you can also see that there are not only multi-story apartment buildings here, but also these charming little villas. Of course, the residents suffer from the excessive attention they receive from all the tourists. Well, because these villas are just incredible, they're like something out of a fairy tale. You can see references to Dante there, and you can also see references to Florence. All of this is a true work of art. But this one has recently become the most famous entrance of them all. A large number of different movies were filmed here. The latest one is House of Gucci. So this was the very entrance that our Gucci was coming out of at the exact moment he was shot. Gucci really did live here. And Madonna almost bought an apartment here. They say that when she was viewing the apartment and was finally ready to sign the legal papers, she ran into a local resident who expressed something that was quite unpleasant and rude to her in Italian. She really didn't like that, so she decided not to go through with the purchase. Look at all the deep symbolism here. Even just this black and white finish already refers us to Masonic symbolism. You can see both salamanders here and a seahorse. The interesting thing is, with seahorses, it is actually the males that give birth. So this also all relates quite closely to esotericism. The architect Coppedi worked not only on the facade of these houses, but also on the detailed interior. His father was a professional sculptor who specialized in wood carving. Of course, this had a significant and lasting influence on the young Coppedi. He designed the interior of every entrance hall and apartment, so every apartment here is a truly unique masterpiece of art. But most of the apartments are residential. We haven't been able to find anyone to invite us inside the building yet, so I'll only show you the entrance. In general, life in Rome is very expensive because real estate is expensive here. All the food and clothes cost the same as in other cities, and basically it's very affordable. I mean, for example, at my local greengrocer, fruits and vegetables cost from 1 to 4 euros per kilo, but real estate costs 5,000 euros per square meter on average. While in the center, these amounts rise to 10,000 euros. But let's see exactly how much a magnificent apartment costs here. In the most beautiful Coppedi quarter, if I were choosing where to live, I would probably choose this specific quarter if I had enough money. For example, a 350 square meter apartment costs 3.2 million. And by the way, that's not even expensive at all. 230 meters are 2 million, and 1,000 square meters, apparently one of these little villas, are 7 million. 7 million for a little villa in the center of Rome, though without the surrounding property, without a garden, is not that bad. What else? A full 200 square meters is 2 million, but they were personally designed by Coppedi himself. And here's another example of how antiquity still influences the modern city today. You can see the ancient Roman walls behind me. By the way, this is the most overlooked Roman monument. These walls were built back in the 3rd century. And that's 19 kilometers of walls that are almost completely preserved. And today, everything inside the walls is the city center. Outside the walls, it's no longer the center. Even if you take a taxi from the airport, there's a fixed fare of 48 euros to get inside the walls, but outside they'll use the meter and it'll be much more expensive. The walls also border the Via Veneto district, the so-called street of the sweet life. But to be honest, the era of the Italian sweet life, the 60s, is long gone. But this street is still one of the most fashionable, with all the 5-star hotels, at least because it's the only one in the center with modern, comfortable buildings. Once, the Ludovisi Gardens were here, which were compared to the gardens of Versailles. But in the early 20th century, the Ludovisi family decided to sell this land for urban development. Still, this street has its own charm. In particular, Harry's Bar is still here. This is the very establishment where the sweet life used to happen. In the 60s, all the most famous Italian and American actors met here. Audrey Hepburn, Anita Ekberg, Sophia Loren, Marcello Mastroianni, and many others. Of course, that fashionable atmosphere is gone now, but this little bar is worth a visit. By the way, let's go have some coffee. At least because this bar recently appeared in one of my favorite movies, The Great Beauty. I highly recommend watching it if you're planning a trip to Rome. We are, of course, drinking coffee. Generally, in Italy, coffee is had after lunch or dinner, but there's one thing. All drinks with a lot of milk, cappuccino, latte, cafe latte. By the way, never just order a latte or they'll just bring you milk. Latte means milk. Order a cafe latte. All these milk drinks are breakfast drinks. After lunch, after 12, and after dinner, it's only espresso, which Italians consider the standard only acceptable coffee. Or, at the very most, an espresso with a drop of milk, the so-called cafe macchiato. And if you don't drink caffeine, there's barley coffee, or if you like ginseng coffee. By the way, it's really tasty. It's coffee made from a ginseng root. It's caffeine-free and energizing, and I imagine myself to be Audrey Hepburn, drinking my coffee in this atmosphere. Few people realize it, but Rome is also the birthplace of the Baroque. In the 17th century, this style, born here in Rome, eventually spread across all of Europe. Now, if I mention the Baroque, the first name that will come to your mind will be, of course, Bernini. Gian Lorenzo Bernini, he created all the most beautiful things in Rome. He became world famous primarily thanks to Dan Brown's novel, Angels and Demons. And obviously, I couldn't miss that very sculpture that Dan Brown wrote about. Let's go and see Saint Teresa together in the church of Santa Maria della Vittoria. The main feature of the Baroque is the desire to make an impression in every possible way. This is how contrast appears. The combination of gilding and white marble, the combination of marble of different colors, and of course, a huge number of various folds that convey emotions. After all, in the 17th century, theater is born, secular music appears, and painting and architecture combine all of this within themselves. That is why Bernini depicts the main scene in the center, the ecstasy of Saint Teresa, and on the sides, as if in a theater box, the patrons are sitting. I'll tell you a secret. Catholic churches are basically one big cemetery. Wealthy families would buy these chapels, earning the right to be buried here, but in return, they decorated them lavishly. And this decoration was a reflection of both the family's taste and the family's wealth. So here we have the patrons who were buried right here. And they're discussing something among themselves. Someone's reading the Holy Scripture, because Saint Teresa is not only the nun who experienced divine ecstasy, but also the one who described it. Moreover, she spoke of an angel piercing her heart with an arrow and bliss spreading throughout her entire body. Yes, this description strongly reminds us of an ecstasy that is quite earthly. That's how Bernini depicted it, not because he was a non-believer. In fact, he was a very religious man, a Catholic, because he was searching for a way, familiar to him, to express something inexpressible, a spiritual ecstasy. The angel plunges the arrow into Teresa's heart with delight, and Teresa conveys her emotions through the folds. In Bernini's work, the folds are an extension not only of the gesture, but also of the internal state. Also, Bernini remembered a story from his childhood. Once, when he was a little boy, only 5 years old, his father was working in the church of Santa Maria Maggiore, along with other sculptors and painters, and they were constantly arguing among themselves, trying to determine whose work was more important, that of a sculptor or of a painter. And to resolve this dispute, they invited Galileo himself. And so Galileo replied, "I understand that the sculptor's work is harder, but you make stone out of stone, while painters use only paints to create water, air, and fire." And Bernini spent his whole life trying to create something more out of stone, air. It's as if we can actually feel this wind. The clouds seem to be made of a different material. And look, Bernini specifically created an opening at the top to create sunlight out of stone. So this golden hue illuminates everything, creating the effect of sunbeams. Furthermore, the angel's wings genuinely appear to be crafted from individual feathers. When we talk about the Baroque, of course we think first and foremost of Bernini. After all, he left so much behind, he has made such a vast number of sculptures. And essentially, he had the opportunity to change the face of an entire city, Rome. But in reality, the most brilliant architect of the Baroque was still Borromini. He's often called Bernini's rival, but in fact he simply didn't have the chance to bring all his boldest ideas to life because no one wanted to deal with him. He was a very difficult person. He was constantly falling into depression, always arguing, including with clients, and missing all deadlines. But we can see his talent, including right here. This is one of the most famous churches in the world in terms of architecture, the Church of San Carlino, or the Little Church of St. Charles. The thing is, its dimensions are the same as just a single pilaster in St. Peter's Basilica. During its construction, Borromini faced two major problems. They are its small size and an extremely limited budget. Building this modest church actually cost as much as creating just one single fresco in the neighboring Barberini Palace. Well, let's go inside and take a look. Though first we should really pay close attention to this unique facade. Look, Borromini certainly knew exactly where his church would be located. Baroque, by the way, always takes into account the place where it is created. He realized that seeing the church facade would be difficult, so he partially tilted it. This facade seems to hang over us. Here are all the features of Baroque. No straight lines, the absence of right angles, broken corners, broken architectural lines, and of course movement and emotionality. Borromini was actually originally from Switzerland, from Ticino. And he grew up on the lake shore and loved watching how the wind plays with the waves of that lake. You see, it's as if he conveyed those waves right here on the facade. In general, there's a lot of esotericism and a lot of mathematics in Borromini's architecture. So for him, esotericism was a way of understanding the world through numbers. He was involved in secret societies, those very societies of masons, and tried to understand the world through the harmony of numbers and shapes. Borromini believed that there were only two perfect shapes, the triangle and the circle. And even the ellipse above us, he created it by taking the shape of two circles as a base, and using triangles, he connected all the other elements. None of these columns are standing here just like that by chance. It's all aligned according to specific lines. Borromini didn't like expensive materials. He didn't like marble. So he created the contrast, and contrast is one of the features of Baroque, through the play of light and shadow. He used inexpensive material. Well, essentially it's just simple stucco molding, but it's still so interesting and beautiful. It seems to me that the architecture here truly sounds like music. Everything is just so harmonious. Borromini broke all the rules of classical architecture. He broke the harmony and found this harmony in these very intricate lines. Perhaps Dan Brown should have used Borromini's architecture specifically as the starting point for all his stories in Angels and Demons. But Borromini had very few projects that were fully brought to life. Perhaps Dan Brown simply didn't have enough material for a book. This is also one of the most beautiful courtyards next to the same church. Once again in this project, in a small space, Borromini had to create a courtyard for the personal use of the religious order. There wouldn't have been enough space to create a round courtyard. A square one wouldn't have satisfied our Borromini, so he just decided to cut off all the corners. And look at how interestingly the classical arches combine with these cut-off corners. Once again, our line flows like a wave. And right here, Borromini utilizes a specific technique that absolutely fascinates me. Look at the balustrade. He places these pear-shaped balusters in such a way that one is facing down and the other is facing up. In this specific way, the monks passing by this balustrade could admire the tranquil beauty of the courtyard, and absolutely nothing blocked their view. Borromini dreamed of being buried here. He even designed a luxurious crypt beneath the church, but he committed suicide. Therefore, the monks who were in charge of this church refused to bury him here. Yes, he was buried in a church, but in a different one. And they say that he died because he couldn't stand the competition with Bernini. The most striking contrast between Baroque and the Renaissance can be seen right here. Look at these perfect classical forms, balanced, restrained, and harmonious. But this sense of harmony and statics cannot last forever. So in the Baroque period, dynamics, movement, and intricate curved lines start to appear. Let's compare it with Borromini's church, which he built right inside the existing courtyard of the Sapienza University of Rome. He faced a very difficult task. He had to fit a Baroque church into this classical architecture. But that's why he's considered to be a genius, because he managed to do it. Borromini seemed to copy these arches, but imbued them with a sense of movement, a pulsation. I don't know what impression you get from the video, but to me it's like the rhythm of music. The Baroque style integrates not only architecture and theater, but music as well. Well, the interiors of this church are much more interesting, of course. Yes, Roman sirens are also a part of Rome. Unfortunately, the church is only open on Sunday mornings, so we won't be able to see it. Its unique feature is that when creating the architecture, Borromini combined two elements that he considered ideal, two triangles. On one side, he made the corners concave, on the other side convex, and he carried this architecture from the base of the church to the dome. Usually, architects started construction the other way around. First, they designed the dome and only then created the pilasters, the support for that dome. Here, however, is an absolutely innovative solution, an absolutely innovative dome that reminds us of a snail. We know that Borromini had a collection of all kinds of shells because he was trying to find the perfect mathematics. And indeed, Bernini and Borromini always went side by side. They even worked together in St. Peter's Basilica. But one time, Bernini took all the credit for creating the design of the baldachin in the cathedral, took almost all the money, and Borromini got offended. Since then, they became rivals. It is right here that we can see the history of their conflict. On the left, we can see the palace where Bernini's workshop was located. He lived in a house next door with his family, and the palace opposite, the Propaganda Fede, was built by Borromini. and Borromini discovered a subtle way to mock his great rival. At that time, Bernini built 2 towers in the Pantheon that looked so awkward that the Romans called them donkey ears. So without a second thought, Borromini decorated the windows of this palace in the shape of a donkey with ears. Bernini found a provocative way to respond. He sculpted a phallus out of marble and displayed it right out of his window, clearly telling Borromini exactly where to go. And all this disgrace hung here for a couple of weeks until the Pope finally ordered it to be removed. But the most famous reflection of the rivalry between our Bernini and Borromini is hidden right here in Piazza Navona. The thing is, this is a symbol of the entire Baroque era, and Borromini was building the Papal Palace, this church. And by the way, for the first time here he invented these windows, absolutely not functional but extremely aesthetic. And they also give a lot of light to the rooms. At that time, Pope Innocent X, to whom the palace belonged, preferred Borromini. Bernini actually fell out of favor with him, but Bernini had a talent to bribe or flatter whoever he needed to, and pay off who and what was needed. So, using this, he persuaded the Pope's sister-in-law, who for money displayed a model of this magnificent fountain in the Pope's bedroom, and the Pope, not knowing the author, immediately approved the project. At least that's what the legend tells us. And we can see the coat of arms of the patron, the Pope, and the Pamphili family. You will not be able to find Bernini's signature anywhere. In Rome, it was strictly forbidden to sign your own works. Only the patrons themselves possessed that right. Bernini began to work, but the fountain was originally supposed to be commissioned to his rival Borromini, so he was so furious that he searched for any possible flaws, and he eventually found them. Bernini made a mistake when laying the pipes here, but Borromini did not tell him directly, although various rumors eventually reached Bernini anyway. And they say that Bernini demonstrated his attitude toward Borromini's talent right here. Look, that figure over there is shielding itself from the church in horror. All the other figures are deliberately turning away from the structure of this church. Bernini seemingly wanted to say it's so hideous that it's impossible to look at. The thing is, yes, Bernini built the fountain and Borromini built the church, but Borromini was only given this specific work after the fountain was already finished. So of course this is just an urban legend. But as they say, there's no smoke without fire. So they say that Borromini, just as he was finishing the grand architectural work, insisted that a statue of Saint Agnes be placed to the left of the bell tower, clearly turning her nose up at the fountain below. And that story really seems to be true. Pay attention to the uniquely unusual shape of this square. Does this shape remind you of anything? The shape of this structure should remind you of the Stadium of Domitian. We are currently standing inside an ancient stadium situated directly underneath Piazza Navona. It once held up to 30,000 spectators. This stadium was even larger in size than the Colosseum. However, It wasn't for gladiator games, but for Roman pentathlons, something like the Olympic Games. It was built by Domitian, who went down in history for the terror he unleashed within the country, but he wanted to be remembered as a patron of the arts and a builder. He had a traditional Greek education, so he was very fond of the classic Greek athletic games. But later on, the Roman people became less and less interested in these games. With the eventual fall of the empire, the stadium was abandoned and slowly turned into residential houses. So imagine, you have a roof over your head, you have walls, just install the doors and live happily. Many grand structures of the ancient city were gradually turned into simple dwellings during the Middle Ages, having been taken over by the poor. Just imagine, while ancient Rome once had a population of over 1 million people, in the Middle Ages, especially after the plague, the population dropped significantly to a mere 30,000. It is quite clear that by then there was no longer a need for such colossal stadiums, of course. Then, palaces began to be built directly on top of the ancient foundations. The idea was simple. If it has stood for 1,000 years, it will stand for one more. Moreover, some magnificent palaces like Palazzo Braschi or the Doria Pamphilj Palace were built using travertine taken right here from the ancient stadium of Domitian. Right here, for example, there was a staircase, but it was apparently made of wood. We don't know if it's medieval or ancient. And here is a real ancient staircase, though it is reasonable to assume that on top there were polished marble blocks laid out in the past. After all, in Rome everything was made of white stone. Unfortunately, all these marble blocks were used as building material. And all these brick walls were carefully finished with plaster and then completely painted over. Here you can witness how the cultural level of Rome has risen significantly. We are in 1st century Rome. Directly above our heads is the 21st century, a 5-meter difference. But in general, Rome is a very unusual city, at least because people have lived here for at least 2,777 years. And where people live, the cultural layer grows the fastest. But first, it's the Romans themselves building one structure on top of another. And trash is not merely the trash we throw on the streets, like food scraps, bones, and so on. It is also construction debris, the material allowing the city to grow very quickly. But there were also significant floods in Rome. Floods right up until the 19th century. And try to imagine when the Tiber overflowed its banks, of course, it brought a significant amount of silt and clay. Even more plants grew on that, and it all decayed. That's why the cultural level rose so quickly. Ever since the Roman embankment was constructed, there have been no more floods. So since the 19th century, Rome's cultural layer has ceased its growth. So who built this? You probably don't remember Domitian, and that's no accident. He was subjected to total oblivion, the so-called damnatio memoriae, by decision of the Senate. The thing is, Domitian essentially revived the imperial cult. He formally declared himself to be the absolute master and a god. So yes, a mortal living man called himself a god and insistently demanded that he be given divine honors. By the way, he actively demanded this even from the Jews, and many Jews preferred death because they had a rule not to worship other gods. And Domitian was a deeply suspicious and paranoid individual. He was born during the era of Nero, remembered the way in which Nero's reign ended, and indeed constantly perceived the presence of potential traitors in all his surroundings. Well, probably many people who establish a real tyranny within a state constantly fear such a betrayal. Domitian didn't just persecute Stoics and philosophers, but a real terror began under him. The number of trials for treason reached its absolute peak. Now, it is important to remember that in ancient Rome, traitors were punished not only with death, but with the total deprivation of all their property. For Domitian, this became a source of funds. And the thing is, he didn't just build things like these grand structures to win the people's love, but he also gave colossal sums of money to the army. So the army loved him, and essentially by relying on his army, he tried to hold on to power. 15 years of terror passed, at the end of which Domitian was eventually assassinated in a conspiracy. Moreover, he accused several prominent and high-ranking officials of treason, and after that, they were the ones who united in a plot against Domitian. One of the participants in this conspiracy was even his own wife. We have many detailed historical accounts from that time. We know a great deal about this emperor, thanks in large part to Suetonius. He even described his physical appearance. Arrogance on the brow, anger in the gaze, effeminate weakness in the body. They said he was, to put it mildly, a bit fat, with shamelessness in the face masked by a deep blush. So not only was he suspicious and deeply cruel, but he was also driven by intense lust. It was said that the one and only true love of his life was his niece. And it was rumored that the niece even tried to have an abortion by Domitian, which resulted in her death. And so 15 years of this terror ended with the death of the emperor, whom everyone always tried to forget. With him, the entire Flavian dynasty ended, and only the stadium lives on to this day. We might not even have remembered him if it weren't for the stadium. And the obelisk of Domitian, which stands to this day in Piazza Navona. Moreover, Domitian depicted himself there between two Egyptian gods, so he apparently really considered himself a god. And by dying as a result of a conspiracy, Domitian paved the way for the so-called 5 good emperors. Nerva came to power immediately after him. And 100 years, that is almost the entire 2nd century, became a golden age for Rome, when the government was not engaged in terror and military spending, but primarily in the internal policy of the state. I found my glasses. I left them 3 hours ago in the museum and they returned them to me. So don't believe the rumors that everyone steals in Rome. No one snatches bags here either, but you should watch your wallets in the crowd. This is the narrowest street in the city. And now I will show you an unusual place. We are in a private palace. Actually, there's a hotel here and there are 2 amazing terraces, one with a restaurant and the other just for an aperitif. We came without a booking, but don't make the same mistake. Book in advance. Let's go up. Just drinking wine with a view of Borromini's architecture? Well, that only happens in Rome. I love this city. Rome is really a very noisy city. And in order to feel the peace and quiet, it is worth going up to the terrace. I absolutely love Roman terraces. By the way, I even have a selection of them. If you need it, DM me and I'll send it to you. One of my favorite terraces is this one because from here you have a view of the whole city. and also of my favorite Piazza Navona. Of course, it's a special pleasure to come up to the terrace at sunset, but right now I am using this terrace to show you our true hero, the videographer Nastya, who was involved in the entire creation of this video.
She's also my close friend. So everything that we've achieved isn't just my credit, but Nastya's as well.
I promised to show you some interesting places. And one of those places that nobody knows about is the Galleria Spada. It's a museum that shows what Roman residential palaces look like from the inside. In particular, this little courtyard is hidden behind walls, as is often the case. In this gallery, you can imagine what the homes of wealthy noble people looked like back then. Here, for example, there's even a sculpture by Bernini, our favorite Bernini, without any kind of label, just as it would have been in the 16th and 17th centuries. And it's sitting on a tabletop that's also from the Baroque era. You can see the frescoed ceiling above and the paintings displayed, well, basically in the style that was fashionable at the time. Paintings weren't museum exhibits, they were a way to decorate the walls. In certain eras, paintings were often much cheaper than mirrors or fine silk wallpaper finishes. This palace belonged to a cardinal, in this case, Cardinal Spada. Spada means a sword, and over there on his coat of arms are 3 swords. During this era, owning a collection of ancient sculptures also meant boosting your social status. You could certainly say that these galleries served as a kind of 17th century swag. First, I will show you who I am and the wealth I have, and then I will allow you to speak to me. There are even 2 paintings here by the famous Artemisia Gentileschi, one of the very few female artists to make it into history. To tell you the truth, she had a very unfortunate and unenviable fate. She was raped by a close friend of her father's who was also an artist, after which she not only lost her reputation but was even forced to leave Rome. And her rapist suffered no legal punishment at all, because at that time rape was considered a crime not against the person, but against honor. And he promised to marry her. Effectively, this could counterbalance the crime. The major problem was, however, that he was already married at the time. So he did not marry the young girl, and the girl was forced to endure the condemnation of the entire city. After that, she had nothing left to feel ashamed of, and so she painted nude portraits, including those of herself. Yet she went down in history as a true female artist. Right here in the Galleria Spada is one of the most interesting spots, a masterpiece by Borromini. Another feature of the Baroque style is optical illusion, and it's best seen right here. In the Spada gallery, there's the famous Borromini perspective. How long do you think this gallery is? 8 meters, 82 centimeters, but it seems that the depth is probably 35 meters. The effect used to be even stronger because the far wall was once completely covered in frescoes, just as this inner courtyard was also painted with frescoes. You've guessed why, right? You can see how the columns narrow and Borromini reduced their height to create this effect. In the middle of the 17th century, no one else but Borromini had ever created anything like this. He is a true genius. The 17th century is a new era when people began to take an interest in science as well. But it is important for us to remember that Galileo's time was the 17th century. Galileo was the first person to have written his scientific works in Italian instead of Latin. In other words, it was a time when understanding the world became accessible to ordinary people. But there was one truly extraordinary man who was far ahead of his own time. And yes, you guessed it, I'm talking about Caravaggio, my absolute favorite artist, whose career began right here with this very church. And by the way, he also utilized the Fibonacci sequence to create the composition of his paintings. This church is very important to me and it's very personal. It was right here that I first experienced Stendhal syndrome. I fell in love with art, with Caravaggio, and generally became fascinated by the history of Christianity after seeing these paintings for the first time. Imagine at a time when mannerism was in fashion, that is, imitating the style of Raphael and Michelangelo, when everyone wanted to see sugary, overly idealized painting, when the affluent and powerful elite hung this idealism in their palaces, trying to distance themselves from the gritty, harsh reality filled with suffering and bitterness of the street. Caravaggio boldly brings this street, this realism, onto his canvases and into the church as well. He takes real people as models, puts them in complex poses, and paints life exactly as it appears in reality. He rejected all the rules of convention, essentially starting painting from scratch as early as the end of the 16th century. And by the way, that's why at first no one even wanted to buy Caravaggio's work. Just imagine the cardinals who create their own world in palaces, brilliant and luxurious. Who needs dirty feet and beggars inside those palaces? But for an artist, being exhibited in a church is the ultimate dream. It's like getting into the Venice Biennale today. After all, who can see you in a palace? Hardly anyone. But inside this church, there are thousands. Caravaggio's career begins right here. And the first painting he produced was The Martyrdom of Saint Matthew. Here he is creating this Fibonacci sequence primarily because this is his very first attempt. He has not yet fully established the core idea of his style. He paints some architectural columns, some stone steps and clouds, which we will certainly not see at all in Caravaggio's later work. And another distinctive feature of this piece is the dramatic play of light and shadow. For him, the background is not important, only what is in front of us matters. Take a very close look at this vividly bright white color. Caravaggio, unlike his contemporaries, covered the canvas with a dark base layer. Usually the primer was white and black paints were used on it. In this area, it was essential to paint with white paint, and to achieve this visual effect, Caravaggio had to add lead oxide to the paints, a highly toxic substance that may have severely damaged his psyche, because the long-term effects of heavy metals destroy not only the physical body, but also the psyche. And of course, for Caravaggio, this painting was deeply biographical, so he depicted his own self-portrait here. This is the most interesting painting. Yes, this is a biblical scene. Jesus calls upon Matthew to become his disciple. Matthew points to himself. Do you really consider me truly worthy? He was a publican who served essentially as a customs officer and a tax collector, and his right hand, out of habit, still continues to count the coins. But taking advantage of the confusion, the young man nearby swipes a few coins. All of these events happened in the 1st century, but Caravaggio painted a scene that was deeply familiar to him, a tavern from the late 16th century. Everyone gathered here to outplay at cards the aristocrat sitting with his back to us. That he is an aristocrat can be guessed by the presence of his sword. You can guess that he is wealthy by the fact that he has bright white clothes, and on the right there is Jesus. And his right hand is pointing directly at Matthew. This hand is remarkably identical to the famous hand depicted by Michelangelo in the Sistine Chapel. That is, Caravaggio is suggesting that he does not reject classical art. He simply goes even further beyond it. Here Matthew is writing the New Testament. Look at how the stool has slipped out from under his feet. That is, he manages to remain upright only by turning toward the angel. Caravaggio used this effect on purpose to extend beyond the boundaries of the painting. And by the way, the angel is holding his fingers in the shape of infinity, again a mathematical symbol. Matthew's clothes are not simple. This yellow and red color is the flag of Rome, the flag of the Roman municipality. So Caravaggio is expressing his gratitude to the whole city. Entrance to Roman churches is always free, but the lighting costs money. You have to drop a coin, and then the painting will light up. As I was talking, someone's already dropped one in. By the way, that very flag is kept right here, inside a private patrician palace on the 2nd floor. Just don't tell anyone. This family owned this flag during the times of papal Rome, and they're afraid that if the Vatican suddenly remembers they have it, they'll take it back. So the poor things lost their Caravaggio. They still have a spot like that on the silk wallpaper in their living room. The thing is, the grandfather of this family sold the Caravaggio for pennies to the National Gallery in London, just to provide a dowry for his daughters. That's the fate of Roman patricians. They lose their property, go bankrupt, and all they have left is their title and history, but not for everyone. Look, the members of the noble Patrizi family and their names. We have spent so much time discussing the Baroque period that we nearly forgot to mention that masters Raphael, Michelangelo, and Baldassare Peruzzi all worked right here. Just imagine, back in the year 1512, there lived in this city at the exact same time Raphael, Michelangelo, and even Leonardo da Vinci. It is remarkable that only in Rome and a few other historic Italian cities can you still see Raphael's frescoes for free inside a local church. Let us go take a look at them now. These are the frescoed Sibyls by Raphael. Here he showed himself at his best. While admiring Raphael's Madonnas, his use of color, and the play of light and shadow, we often forget that he was also a master of composition. Compare, for example, how his contemporary did it at that time. Baldassare Peruzzi was the artist people turned to if they wanted to be sure it was done well. He was used to working in large spaces, so when he was given a small space, he simply scaled down the scenes, scaled down the characters, turning it all into something like a comic strip. So, what does Raphael do? He also skillfully manipulates the awkward space and rests all the Sibyls on the arch. That is, he seamlessly incorporates this element into the composition to create a sense of greater spatial depth and more air. Raphael even depicts the wooden ceiling above them at an unnatural angle. Sibyls are ancient pagan figures and prophetesses, but they solemnly foretold the birth of Christ, so they rightfully earned the honor to be placed here. and it would seem that everything here is okay. But not at all. First of all, Raphael paints one of the Sibyls with the face of his beloved, his muse Fornarina, the baker's daughter. He painted many of his pictures and frescoes from her. And she's looking at the blonde woman with envy. They say that the blonde is also a real woman, the most celebrated courtesan of that time, Imperia. Back then, they said the Roman gods gave Rome two treasures. The god of war gave the Roman Empire, and the goddess of love gave the courtesan Imperia. She was a highly educated lady. She knew Greek and Latin, meaning she could read philosophers in the original, played music, and appreciated art. So it is truly no surprise that Raphael admired her so much. But she was the mistress of his friend and client, so if there was any connection between them, it remained a well-kept secret. And I think the most fascinating thing is to get lost in the winding Roman alleys. That is how you can discover something truly unusual. Well, first of all, don't forget to look around. There, for example, we have a typical medieval house with small windows. And the shutters are solid because glass used to be incredibly expensive. So shutters were used instead of glass. And there's an ancient Roman column where a car is even parked right next to it. And while you're looking one way, we're going to go in from the other side, of course, into the courtyard, because all the most beautiful things are hidden inside. This is the Bramante cloister. From a purely architectural standpoint, it is a true icon. Donato Bramante is the architect who successfully put all the dogmas of ancient classical architecture into practice. That is, he read Vitruvius's treatise, on the basis of which, by the way, Da Vinci would later create his Vitruvian Man, and he applied that knowledge here. We don't often think about it, but in the ancient world, there were strict rules about the ratio of height to width of an arch, the height and width of a column, even the ratio of the capital to the base. After all, in the ancient world, architecture was viewed as a living person. And here we can even trace the entire history of architecture with you. For example, it all began with the ancient Doric order, then transitioned to the Ionic order, and finally at the top you can see the ornate Corinthian order. And architects from all over the world still go crazy over this courtyard. All the palaces that appeared after this courtyard was built, that is from the 16th century onwards, were of course inspired by it. But this isn't a palace, instead it is just a monastery courtyard that has now been completely turned into a museum of modern art. And by the way, do you hear that sound of plates and glasses clinking? I will show you another very unusual and hidden cafe located right here. Here, a cafe was opened inside a work of art, a work of modern art. This is from 2021 called The Trap of Love. And just imagine, all this wallpaper was created exclusively and specifically for this room. All the furniture was also created specifically for this room. And on the walls, there are fragments of famous works of art. And right here through the window, you can see a fresco by Raphael. People are already drinking Aperol. Well, it's an aperitif. The Italian aperitif is a very important moment in life when people meet before dinner for a glass of wine or an aperol, which really gets the appetite going, not to replace dinner, but to serve as an excellent preparation. And actually, I want to tell you that in Italy, especially in Rome, there are strict rules. Lunch is from 1 to 3, dinner is from 7:30 to 10:30, and naturally, no good place will feed you outside of those hours. So every single moment of the day has its own special drink and its own food. It all starts with coffee and a warm croissant. Well, or in Rome, it could also be a maritozzo, a sweet bun with whipped cream. Then comes lunch, then the aperitif, and then after the aperitif, dinner. Ideally, of course, if it's summertime, you'd also go up to some terrace at sunset. So, how do Romans spend their evenings? Either in restaurants or at private parties, because Romans still live in closed social circles. But I hope that during all this time I've shown you Rome truly from the inside. And from you, all I would like to ask for is just a like and a comment about how much you enjoyed the video. I really worked hard. So please subscribe to my YouTube channel, and I send you all my very best wishes. Kisses to everyone and goodbye.